I'd like to welcome you all for joining us. Um Already quite a few of us on the Zoom meeting. This is before we start in terms of the substance. Um, I just want to say a few things about this initiative. This Foreign Policy Talks is a new initiative that the CIS, together with WIG Panorama, the International International Council, the International Relations Council of Turkey, led by Mustafa Aydin, we decided to work together to start this new series. And I guess inspired by COVID and all of us working at home, this has become a means of communication. Um, so. So this is sort of an attempt, and then Mustafa and I talked about what should be our first topic, and we thought that this is a topic we need to discuss. And that's why we're starting with Greek-Turkish relations. Next week, we'll be dealing with the Black Sea. I'll talk about it at the end. Welcome to this meeting. Mustafa, Aydin, you want to say something about this new project that we've launched?
Thank you, Dimitri. Let me welcome everybody also on behalf of International Relations Council of Turkey. Panorama is a new publication. We started in January, mid-January, so it's as old as COVID-19 threat. The aim was to reach general public with academic background and short, accessible analysis. And then we are expanding now with short videos, interviews, etc. And when Dimitris come to me and suggested we should start something, the result was Foreign Policy Talk series, and this is of course the first one. We had to start with Turkish-Greek relations as the first in the series. So let me not take too long. And welcome you all again to this new series. Dimitri.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mustafa. All right. Now, this is, we have four speakers with us. All of them are very qualified and very knowledgeable about the issue. Mustafa Aydin, who is the president of the International Relations Council of Turkey and a colleague of mine at Kadir University in the Department of International Relations. And someone who's been a long time involved in Greek-Turkish issues. In fact, he and Kostas Ifantis had the first joint Greek-Turkish academic collaboration when they co-wrote a book in 2004 on Greek-Turkish relations, an edited volume. More recently, Mustafa Aydin is, like myself, Soli, Özel, and even more recently, Panayotis, Tsakonas. We're all members of the Greek-Turkish Forum, and Mustafa Aydin is also the Turkish coordinator of the Greek-Turkish Forum, the two coordinators there. And the Greek-Turkish Forum is a 1.5-track initiative where Greeks and Turks and Cypriots, Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots interact periodically to try to address our issues. Our next speaker is Kostas Ifantis, who I mentioned, who is a professor of international relations at Panteion University. Until very recently, he was also a colleague of ours at Kadir University, where he had a double appointment with his university in Athens and Kadir University, but he decided to leave us and stay in Athens. Another colleague with a long-standing involvement in Greek-Turkish issues. As I mentioned, he's co-written the book with Mustafa. Kostas and I have also worked recently on many issues, in particular on foreign policy elite surveys, Greek foreign policy elite and Turkish foreign policy elites, trying to assess how they view each other. Also with us is Soli Özel, who is also a colleague at Kadir University, but Soli is also currently a visiting fellow at the Institut Montaigne in Paris, a former Bosch fellow, a columnist in many outlets here in Turkey, someone who, Soli Özel is my oldest Turkish friend. I met him before I met Mustafa, and I think the two of them are the oldest Turkish colleagues and friends that I know. Soli even remembers that when we first met in Bosnia. You told me Tuzla, right? It was. I had forgotten that, but you reminded me. Long time ago. And we worked together over the past. When I was a fellow at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, Soli was a visiting fellow for a couple of months. And obviously he's been involved in this issue as well. He's not a very active member of the forum, but nevertheless, it's always great to have him on board and hear his 2 cents. And the last speaker is Panayotis Tsakonas, who is a professor of international relations at the University of Athens and a senior fellow at the ELIAMEP, the Hellenic Foundation for European Foreign Policy, in charge of its program on Turkey, on contemporary Turkey. Panayotis and I also know each other from a long way back. Before I moved to Turkey in 2010, we were colleagues in the Department of Mediterranean Studies at the University of the Aegean in Rhodes, and for about 4 years or so. And Panayotis has also been very much involved in Greek-Turkish relations, and actually has written a number of books. And one of the books that's marked sort of the field is it's called The Incomplete Breakthrough in Greek-Turkish Relations, Grasping Greece's Socialization Strategy, published in 2010, which was even nominated for an Edmund Keeley Book Prize. But he's also been relatively involved in this topic throughout his career. And most of us here also have a lot of policy experience. And it's not just academic, but we've also been involved in our either foreign ministries and defense ministries and other state structures. And so this would make for a very, very interesting topic. Now, before we go, the idea is if you have any questions to ask, you can put them in the chat and I'll try to see which ones, bundle them together and see which ones that we can ask of the speakers. We're going to have about 3 rounds of questions. I have told the speakers, well, they will make brief interventions and let's see what comes out of it and generate a discussion. Now, I want to say that one would expect that this is a normal thing to do, given the circumstances and the times that Greeks and Turks academics get together and talk. It's not that easy anymore. Even though I am an academic, a Greek academic in a Turkish university for the last 10 years, given the level of tension, and I'm speaking a lot from a Greek perspective, from Athens' perspective, it's very difficult to actually get Greeks and Turks to talk. We have monologues on in Greece and maybe in Turkey about this, but Greeks and Turks to talk openly to an audience is something that is rare, and is in a marked contrast to. I remember the second time I came to Turkey, 2003. I was at the time working at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris, and a Spanish colleague and I were invited for a German Marshall Fund event here in Istanbul. And my colleague Martin comes to my office in Paris and he tells me, this is 2003, Dimitri, do I need a visa to go to, do we need a visa to go to Turkey? I said, well, I don't need one, but you should check. And Martin's reaction was, if you don't need one, I don't need one. If you as a Greek, I said, it doesn't work like this, Martin. Martin never checked. He says, you're always joking, so we don't need a visa. So we land at Ataturk airport fly in from Paris. We go through passport control. I let Martin go in first, and he goes to give his passport, and he's told, go there to the right somewhere and get a visa. Martin is shocked. I said, don't worry, Martin, I'll wait for you here. So Martin gets his visa, he comes back. We go through passport control, and as we get out of passport control, there are these pillars, and in one of the pillars right in front of us is a huge banner, and the banner has a Greek and Turkish flag. This was the time that Greece and Turkey were bidding together for the European Football Championship. We never got it. I think it was the 2008 European Football Championship. But for Martin, who had just gone through the shock of him needing a visa and me not needing a visa, the fact that he saw a banner with the Turkish flag with a joint bid, he was shocked, and he turns to me and he goes, you guys, meaning you Greeks and Turks, have been joking to us all these years. And I go, no, Martin, just because our relations are tense does not mean we don't talk to each other. And the only reason I'm saying this, and this has been a long time, it's almost been 20 years. The reason I'm saying this is that it's almost come to the point where we don't necessarily talk to each other as much as we did. And I think this is something to consider as we get into this discussion. Now, and the question is, therefore, does each side understand the other? Does each side understand the other? It's also something key to this. And whether we are talking to each other, trying to understand each other with tools of the past, and maybe things have changed or they haven't. So I would like to start a round of discussion on basically a question or a series of questions on what is the state of Greek-Turkish relations today, or what do you think are the key issues, and what are the key challenges encompassing the relationship? And maybe I'll start with Mustafa and then move on to the other speakers. So Mustafa.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you also reminding us that we co-edited with Kostas a book all those years ago. The book was, subtitle of the book was Escaping the Security Dilemma in the Aegean. And it's almost now 18 years, and if you start counting from the rapprochement, it's 20 years. What happened in those 20 years is the problems that we identified at the time, and many other people identified at the time, which I would call them old problems or traditional problems on Turkish-Greek relations, they have not been solved with the process of rapprochement or negotiations, proximity talks, and etc. But they have managed somehow. They have not flared up since the rapprochement started, and we have not yet come to another position where the two navies and two air forces and the soldiers on both sides of the Aegean are not posing towards each other with menace. So this is a kind of gives us a period of managed but not solved. Problems are not solved, but conclusively we are where we are today. However, the old problems or the traditional problems of Greek-Turkish relations, they are there, not solved, but they are on the background now. They are not what they used to be. The problems of minorities, problems of the Aegean, territorial sea, air flying, poor lines, and etc. They are all still there, but somehow the urgency is not there. However, we have new problems now, or at least maybe let's call them new challenges instead of problems. And chief among them, of course, that they differ from the perspective of Greek and Turkish perspectives. If you look from Greek perspective, it might be different, and from Turkish perspective, it might be different. But I'll try to list some of the challenges that I see, which I think is challenge for both sides. The first is the refugees. This is it's a different kind of problem for two countries. It's different how we understand this as a problem in Turkey, and it's different how the Greeks understand that in Greece. But nevertheless, it is a problem, and it is a challenge that we have to manage. It's there. It's not solved. Urgency is maybe not there. Just before the COVID-19 crisis, there was quite a bit urgency, but now it's not there anymore. But nevertheless, the problem is not solved, and it's there. The second, of course, it's growing, what I would call East-Med or Eastern Mediterranean problem. And this is wider than Cyprus problem, the traditional Cyprus problem. It, of course, involves the Cyprus problem, and because of it, it's more complicated. But it's not only Cyprus. Now it's growing, and new sides are joining, and it's becoming something very complicated. Include the Cyprus problem.
Mustafa, somebody's microphone must be open. I can't understand what you're saying. There is a static, there's a noise behind. I personally cannot hear you.
Okay, could we ask everybody to close their microphones? Yeah. I think it's now closed, right? Okay, so the second problem is Mediterranean, and we might go into the detail. But the problem with this is started to impacting the Aegean issues as well, because of what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean and increasing tension there. some of the older type of problems are resurfacing. We are getting statements, and they started to kind of tickling the old problems again. The problems that haven't heard in last 5 years, maybe last 10 years, suddenly appeared on the agenda. The third problem or challenge is an old challenge, of course, but it's renewed version. It's Cyprus. Somehow, many people are now feeling that are we at the end of the road in Cyprus, one way or another. The feeling of despair is quite increasing, both on the island and outside the island, who are among the people who are studying the issue. And maybe we need something else, a new agenda, a new direction in Cyprus. Otherwise, it's kind of, it becomes unsolvable. Then there is this enveloping all these challenges is the challenge of Turkey's relations with, or Turkey's non-relations with European Union. Because let's remind us that the rapprochement process was anchored in a late, it didn't start with the European Union connection, but it was in later years, it was anchored in Turkey's negotiations with the European Union. So now that's ended. There is no such an anchor anymore. And the challenge is how to rephrase or reframe Greek-Turkish relations without the European Union input. And maybe one final issue that the current challenge, which might not be seen as a challenge in Greece, and I know it doesn't seem as a challenge, but it's seen as a big challenge from the Turkish policymakers and the decision makers. It's the Fethullah Gülen group members in Greece. We are getting, I'm not talking about the soldiers who seek refuge in Greece. This is much beyond that. And there are a number of figures are going around and they are increasing. And the parallels are being drawn with what happened in 1980s with the left-wing Turkish political refugees, or in 1990s what happened with the Kurds or PKK-related Kurds and etc. Now it seems that Fethullah Gülen-related people are flocking into Greece. This is a problem seen from the decision makers' eyes, not much in the public eye in Turkey. So let me stop having listed all these problems or the challenges. Let me stop here, and then we can maybe talk about how we can going to solve all this.
Thank you, Mustafa. I mean, I think you've raised a number of issues which, from a Greek perspective, could be debated and debatable. Even the fact that problems emerges in the plural, and I think some of the things also detaching the EU-Turkey relationship from Greek-Turkish relations is very interesting, and obviously this is not what Athens necessarily wants. But I would like to give the floor now to Panayotis Tsakonas, maybe to hear his insight. Again, we're talking about the same question about the current state of Greek-Turkish relations, the key issues and the challenges. So Panayotis, Taki, please go ahead. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Dimitri. I would propose to think in terms of Greek-Turkish relations in the context of a pen, and see how relations have been evolved since the 70s, so as to get an idea about where we have been and where we now stand, and how things have been developed. So in case you think Greek-Turkish relations you visualize within that pendulum, with the center having a stable Greek-Turkish relations, while at the left end you are moving towards less stable relations or hot incidents or even crises, you see that most of the time Greek-Turkish relations over the years, the pendulum moves from the center, or stable or less stable relations, to either hot incidents or crises, with very few parentheses in between of really stable relations. One might recall at this point the crises that have erupted in the 70s, again in the 80s, and again in the 90s. However, since the late 90s, the pendulum seems to be starting moving towards the right. Literally and metaphorically, and it almost touched upon the right end, where the two states came quite close to the resolution of their conflict. Of course, this was due to Turkey's interest to come closer to the European Union, the shift in Greece's policy vis-à-vis supported Turkey's candidacy. Then, after that, I would say, brief period of, you may call it the halcyon days, that followed the EU Helsinki decisions in 1999, Greek-Turkish relations have again started deteriorating as the freezing of Turkey's accession process, sometime at around 2006, led to a growing interest in Turkey to follow a more independent, I would say, less EU and more ambitious Middle East oriented, and I would call it a security-based rather than interest-based foreign policy. So, and that is the view that comes from most policymakers and security analysts in Greece. Over the last 5 years or so, especially after the failed military coup in 2016 and the presidential elections in 2018, it seems that the so-called new Turkey has adopted a more assertive foreign policy, which have been illustrated by certain actions, military interventions or challenges, even to the legal order of the Eastern Mediterranean. So Turkey has abandoned, as I said, the security-based foreign policy with certain ambitions vis-à-vis its periphery and move further down the path. I would call it a more power-based foreign policy that exhibits the same pattern of assertive behavior in Cyprus, in the Aegean, and in Libya as well, meaning in certain parts of the Middle East and North Africa region, which in turn means, and I think that adds up to what Mustafa has already said, it means that the range of the Greek-Turkish conflict has been broadened as well, with the old conflictual issues, namely over the Aegean Sea, over the Cyprus, have now been linked with new conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa region, in Libya by all means, and to a certain extent in Syria. So we are now standing, I would say, at a very risky and fragile state of relations. It seems that the pendulum has again moved from the less stable relations further left to or closer to a situation which is indeed risky and fragile, given that these developments that are taking place, we're witnessing, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean, in that broader region of the Greek-Turkish conflict, also illustrate the propensity that serious tensions could arise around Cyprus, that could in turn reignite also dormant Greek-Turkish relations over the delineation of, particularly over the delineation of the maritime zones. You should turn your microphone on.
I did.
So yes, thank you very much, Taki. You've taken a much long-term approach, a different approach than what Mustafa has raised, and I think it's very interesting to see it that way, and it's also very telling, therefore, from conventional wisdom in Athens of how what the complexities and the dilemmas are in terms of Greek-Turkish relations today. I'll now give the floor to Soli. Again, it's the same question, the same debate we're talking about, the current state of relations and the challenges.
Thank you. First of all, I don't have to add or repeat what Mustafa has said or what Professor Tsakonas has said about the outstanding issues. What I'd like to do is perhaps raise questions and actually mention two dimensions which I think are effective in making me maybe a bit more sanguine than the previous two speakers. I really find, certainly on the Turkish side, no urgency, but that has always been the case since I first got involved in Turkish-Greek relations back in 1996. Turkey has a much bigger basket of foreign and security affairs menu than does Greece, I think. And in terms of the public here, apart from outbursts like we should change Lausanne or, you know, sending the refugees, creating an unnecessary crisis, all the rumors about Turkish soldiers having crossed the border and Greece is building fences and whatever, I really don't feel, and perhaps because I am removed from Ankara, I really don't feel that kind of an urgency. Eastern Mediterranean is a different matter. That's number one. Now, it strikes me as not insignificant, but maybe not as, maybe too important, that today the Turkish airline, the Minister of Transportation announces that Turkey has actually made deals with 40 countries to start Turkish airline flights again on the 10th of June. Greece is one of those countries. Secondly, the kind of human interaction did not exist despite the fact that there was no visa requirement for Greeks in 1996 that there is today. And I doubt that the islands that are close to Turkish coast can actually prosper without their Turkish clients, with a lot of people also residing in some of those islands. I think those tensions are going to be there. It's going to be a matter of whether or not we can manage them. Today, what I think is very different is the following. Greece is no longer a significant political actor within the EU. Turkey does no longer have any realistic hopes of joining the EU, although the president reiterated on the 9th of May that Turkey's ultimate goal is to become a member of the European Union. And in fact, he said, he used the word, our Europe. It does not really correspond to our realities here. And I think the European Union, which was along with NATO, and I think NATO is far more important in actually calming the waters down back in 1996 after the, 97 after the İmya-Kardak crisis. The European Union played a constructive role. I really doubt that the European Union is a constructive institution when it comes to management of Turkish-Greek relations. Partially because the European Union does not have a unified strategic vision, or policy. And partially because I find, quite frankly, the efforts to use legalisms, not necessarily legality, to deny Turkey what in any international relations course would actually be granted to her in terms of having interests that are legitimate, to which or against which a combination of countries are actually constantly making moves. The 11th of May joint declaration, which the Israelis did not participate, the fact that the European Union has, to my reading, violated its own bylaws and accepted a divided country as a member, which country has then become a big pain in Turkish EU relations, sometimes an excuse, sometimes a real thing. And the fact that on Cyprus, until the gas issue came about, nobody really took the issue seriously, because in all that period, since 1974, not very many people died, but a total of 4. You could just get by, and suddenly the energy sources and their how to share them or not to share them had become an important matter. So I think the moment the European Union acquires a policy vis-a-vis Turkey that deals with it, not transactionally, but strategically, the moment, and I may be prejudiced still, but that the Greek Cypriots recognize that they really cannot have a wrestling match with Turkey, some of the problems that have been with us since the 1970s have continued to linger on, but I don't think we would have any need to be as preoccupied or as anxious about a flaring up of more conflict between Turkey and Greece.
Thank you very much, Soli. Again, your intervention also raises a number of questions in my mind, but I'd like that give the speakers the role of commenting and answering. So next is Kostas. Again, same questions. You've also heard in this first round some of the perspectives from our colleagues. So let's hear what you have to say.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. Okay, when I'm done with my 5, 6, 7, 8-minute remarks, people, our audience, I think, will be amazed on how much we see eye to eye, at least us 5, on our assessment of the state of play, the state of affairs in the between Greece and Turkey. Okay, first of all, thank you very much, you and Mustafa, for taking the trouble to organize this discussion. And I agree that it is not easy. We don't talk as people would expect. And I think we don't talk because there is very little to say. As Mustafa said, 2004, we co-edited a book. Most of the contributions are still very much relevant, both in terms of analysis and in terms of explaining things. The one caveat before I proceed that if there are, by the way, it's almost a family event. Most of the people attending are good friends. So, but if there are any firebrands in the audience, let me indicate that I'm not here to fight the good fight, or any fight for that matter. Okay, and I would like to confess that I cannot recall, as I said, the last time we felt the need to assess the current state of play in Greek-Turkish relations. With Mustafa, it was 21 years ago, when he had set up a one-day conference in at the main amphitheater of Ankara University. And it was a full house, and it was a fired up audience because it was the day after our regular Greek-Turkish crisis rendezvous after the Özel affair. Since then, we had lived through a period of relative calm. Tensions were kept at bay. The official discourse until very recently was one of embracing, engagement, a conditional engagement, a procedural rather than substantive effort to address the long-standing issues was made, and bilateral relations flourished at many levels. The volume of trade grew manifold. We witnessed the gradual formation of constituencies in both sides of the Aegean that somehow refused to view the social and societal interactions as extraordinary, which was the case before in the 90s and the 80s and the 70s. And overall, a cultural and economic and social context manifested itself in a variety of practical ways. By all means, we have to admit that in the last 20 years, a positive acquis was accumulated. An acquis, however, that we failed to capitalize on. Why? Because of domestic constraints and political and economic developments in both countries. The very real security issues were never dealt with. In Greece, it was very early, the debt crisis that destabilized the political system and allowed a very toxic form of populism to rise and take over the politics of the country. And in Turkey, the need to consolidate power at home by AKP and Recep Tayyip Erdogan and to project influence eastwards sort of carried the day. Eventually, whatever momentum was there fell victim to a number of negative domestic and structural dynamics. Let me list some of them. The cul-de-sac in Turkey's European vocation, a primordial public discourse in Greece with political forces conducting politics with a very strong Greek civil war flavor and nationalistic, ultra-nationalistic preferences. Remember the government, the coalition government between Syriza and the independent Greeks, and that setting, endangered the post-junta political consensus in Greece. Another development that became an obstacle was a profound stalling of the democratic process in Turkey, both before and after the criminal attempted coup of the summer of 2006, and this was coupled with a nationalistic turn of the government, of the governing elites, maybe out of necessity, or it seems that way. Also, we had a total collapse of the security landscape in the Middle East that affected Turkey's security concerns. We had, of course, the latest failure to resolve the Cyprus issue, and as Soli mentioned, the discovery of energy resources in Eastern Med, which in the case of Greek-Turkish relations turned out to be a curse rather than a blessing. And I think I will stop here. I think I will. This is how I think the landscape is can be mapped out.
Thank you, Kostas, for your expose. And again, you've raised questions. I mean, that give a lot of food for thought. I'm also saying that you guys have been giving longer explanations, exposés. So what I will do is, because the second question I was planning to ask you, you've sort of addressed it already, where relations are today and why they are where they are today. And I think many of you went through a sort of a historical analysis which explains many things. And how do we move beyond? So let me go basically to the third one. How do we move forward? Given this context, can we move forward to some sort of mutually acceptable relationship? What kind of relationship? The status quo as it is today, the status quo ante, which is maybe what today is without a lot of the uncertainty that has arisen over the last few years since, and from what I've heard from all of you, 2015, 2016 seem to be sort of a change. Or do we need to move beyond to some concrete resolution? And is that possible at all? Today, in the Greek press in Tanea, Thanos Dokos, the Deputy National Security Advisor, who is an old friend of ours here as well, wrote a very interesting piece, and with a title which had a question mark, and then let me translate it. He said, is a change in framework possible for Greek-Turkish relations, right? And I think, and of course, he was addressing in the piece a Greek audience because there's a big debate generated in Greece about the state of relations. But it was very interesting in the way Thanos tried to raise this, and I think this is what the question is. And maybe we'll go very quickly again in order, maybe with Mustafa, to see how do we move ahead, and what does moving ahead actually mean? What sort of relationship, given the circumstances?
Thank you, Dimitri. Let me start the second round of questions that you actually didn't ask, but I'll frame my answer within that as well. I'll start with something Soli said, and which is important. It was in one of my notes here. I think we have one of the challenges that we are facing today. The two countries, and especially the civil societies in two countries, have become complacent. I mean, this is not only because from the Turkish perspective, of course, we are not as much interested in Greek-Turkish relations because we have so many other issues, but nevertheless, even the people who are interested in Greek-Turkish relations are very complacent because of kind of a managed situation that I already indicated in my first intervention. Whenever since there is no urgency of crisis, the people who should be interested in dealing with this issue do not have the urgency of dealing with it. So we let it go. It takes place as if in a vacuum. It takes in its own life. The rapprochement is not anymore tended either by the Turkish state or by the Greek state or even by Greek and Turkish civil society. I remember the early days of the rapprochement when there was a number of meetings between two sides, the civil societies, individuals, academics, diplomats, several meetings, and everybody was searching way of going forward, searching way to solve of the problems. But now, even the proximity talks finished after, I don't know, I think 63 rounds. So this is one of the problems and when we are looking for the future to move forward, this is something that we have to address. We have to find new ways of talking to each other. And this has to involve, and I said this somewhere else, kind of a fact-checking and fact-correcting. Both societies are quite well known of exaggeration of the issues that they care. And this is especially true for the presses on both sides. And since somebody that I follow on both sides, press and media in general and social media also, I see that there is so much of fake information, fake news, crisis-ridden analysis, and etc. And this has to be countered. And this cannot be countered by the states themselves. This has to come from the civil society, and some sort of a countering this negative narrative has to come. And we have to come up with some sort of a new narrative for Greek-Turkish relations. The second problem and the solution that we have to find is there was some sort of an unrealistic expectation of decoupling of Greek-Turkish relations. I always found it as unrealistic, and I think the history of last 20 years, and especially the recent years or recent months, have proven me correct that we cannot really decouple Cyprus from Greek-Turkish relations, because one of them always keep poisoning the other one. So my suggestion here has always been a grand bargaining. Whether that's possible or not, the other way, it didn't work. I mean, you know, the 63 rounds of proximity talks about the agency have managed to contain the problems, but it has not managed to solve the problems. So maybe we have to widen framework of the negotiations. We have to maybe widen and change the issues that we are discussing and come up with out-of-the-box discussions and solutions. And finally, I think we need some sort of a new beginning, a new commitment. Talking about the rapprochement process after 20 years is not ideal situation, and it's not correspond to the reality. And, you know, rapprochement cannot continue 20 years. It happened, it finished. The political situation in both countries changed. Politicians on both countries changed. Even the diplomats who initiated the process has changed. The academics got old. We have new generations of researchers, diplomats, and politicians, and we have new generation of problems and challenges. So if we are to continue to deal with each other, we have to restart maybe a new round of rapprochement, and with, you know, in tandem with the new realities. How are we going to do that? Well, we'll discuss. Let me stop here.
Yeah, thank you, Mustafa. Thank you for raising these points. You know, it is very interesting, especially your point. And I think you are the point you talked about, new ways of talking to each other and fact checking and fact correcting is something that we experience together. I think you know, one of the things that I do is a Greek-Turkish Young Leaders Symposium every year, and the last one was in December in Kavala, where 15 young leaders from Greece and Turkey and 15 from Turkey met. And apart from, we talked to them about relations, bilateral relations, and they worked together on common project ideas. And of the 3 project ideas that were presented by mixed groups of Greeks and Turks, fact-checking kept coming up and fact-correcting. And that was very inspiring. And that was something very inspiring because we never led them onto this. But this is, and these are very mixed groups also, representing different perspectives on Greek-Turkish relations in either country. And very recently, again, about a month ago, because this was a really good meeting, I dubbed it the Spirit of Kavala, and we had a Zoom meeting of the group again. At a time where there's even more tension between the two. And this theme came up again from the participants that were given the floor, the young Greeks and the Turks. So that's interesting. It's something maybe we should listen to because it's also linked to the next generation generations we need to focus on. So let me now give the floor to Panayotis Tsakonas. Again, same sort of questions and framework.
Right. Well, let me start by from your last remark about the role of the youth and the civil society in general, and touch upon some of the remarks made by Mustafa also. I think we should have in mind, we should take into consideration we're now living in a totally different universe than the one we've been living in 2000 from 2000 to 2004, or about that time of the experiencing the positive effects of rapprochement and so on and so forth. Meaning that at the time there have been some good reasons and some good factors for the civil society and the youth, along with other societal factors, to be empowered by the process that have taken place, and especially by the prospects of Turkey becoming a member of the European Union, which is not the case anymore. So we have to take into account to what extent and how much those domestic actors can be empowered by a strong, let's say, prospect, which I cannot really see at the moment. Number two, I think we have to, going straight to your question about the how we can move forward. I think the history of Greek-Turkish relations suggests that a kind of a stepwise process should be followed for relations, at least to come back to the state of stable relations, where issues, of course, of high politics and their differences will remain unresolved, and probably parallel monologues will take place. Yet the two states can have a sincere dialogue over a number of issues. So I doubt that we can, in a way, jump to any kind of resolution to the conflict. So within that stepwise process, I would put forward, first of all, as things stand now, what is important is, I think, to develop channels, which I doubt are there, that would, I would say, opt for the easing of tensions, and most of all manage to make clear that a hot incident or a war in the Aegean would be a detriment to both sides, that there will be no gains for any party. And that in turn means that Turkey should put aside any policies of, I would call them, myopic optimization, meaning short-term gains to certain actions developing, especially in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think much will depend on Erdogan's decisions and policies, and I think so far he has proved himself to be pragmatic and decide to even make U-turns. The example of Russia is the first that comes to my mind. Yet, I would say, under the conditions that such turns will entail, will not entail devolution of power, sharing of power. Which brings me to my second point, that would, I think, have positive effects and lead to better Greek-Turkish relations, although one should, by all means, take into consideration some of the arguments highlighted by Soli Özel. I think of a kind of a new deal, I would say. Greece actually should opt for in being concluded between the EU and Turkey. It seems that EU had managed to do a lot so far in the past, especially in the past, towards conflict resolution, while it now looks it can do little even with regard to conflict management of conflict prevention. However, I think there is still some leverage, especially due to Turkey's dire economic situation, that might allow for a new deal that would manage to address certain issues, certain thorny issues like the migration challenge, along, I would say, with a new updated customs union between the EU and Turkey. And to my mind, all three parties in Greece seem to agree on a kind of a transnational logic with regard to the commencement of negotiations between the European Union and Turkey for a modernization of the customs union. And they also seem to appear receptive to sound out the possibility of an upgrade to customs union, provided, of course, that certain conditions, political conditions, will be also attached to it, like, for example, which are important to Greece, notably issues related to security or to defense or to migration. And last, I would like to highlight the issue of the difficulty of the Greek politicians to make hard decisions by referring most of the time to the fact that they can hardly overlook the Greek public's negative perception or perceptions over Turkey. And I would like at this point to raise, to draw your attention to a public opinion research which has been conducted sometime in late 2019, which revealed that although the absolute majority of the Greek public considers that Turkey is a gravest threat to Greece's security, around 90% or 89%. At the same time, that the electorate's perception and feelings with regard to Greece's stance towards future relations with Turkey are positive by being in favor at around almost 70%, 67% of a pragmatist, of the need of a pragmatist approach that promotes bilateral dialogue with Turkey, as well as further anchoring Turkey in the EU. A particular prerequisite is in it for this policy being adopted and being developed by Greece, apart from easing of political relations, as I mentioned, and to a certain extent the cessation of Turkey's assertive policy in the Eastern Mediterranean. I think the biggest obstacle, the main problem, has to do with, for better relations or to any agreement between Greece and Turkey, is Turkey's recognition of the Republic of Cyprus. I'll stop at this point.
We're starting to run over, but we'll continue for about 15 minutes. Give both Soli and Kostas a chance to say a couple of things, and also then maybe take a couple of questions. But let me just say, because it's interesting when it comes to youth, and Taki, you were talking about what motivated groups, civil society groups, when the accession process was on, and there's nothing here now. I disagree with you. I think there is. Because you refer to public opinion poll, Mustafa does a lot of these also. And it's very interesting that even though, and we heard from some of the comments, there's a negative attitude vis-a-vis the EU, the last public opinion poll that Mustafa did about Turkish civil society, there is a majoritarian trend in favor of the EU accession process. And the reason this is, I would say, is it has to do with the issue of democratization and democracy. It has to do with that. Because when we talk about customs union, well, I've heard a lot of Turks also say, well, let's there include norms and values because this helps us. And likewise, I think Kostas raised the point too about the division that existed in Greece, the polarization, and the threat of populism itself, which is not a thing that comes and goes, it's gone. It's there in the background, and should relations deteriorate, this would create, I think, the conditions in Greece for non-dialogue. And I think this is a motivating factor somehow. This is what I see from the youth that we work with, that on both sides understand this somehow, even if it's subconsciously, and the need therefore to create maybe a new framework for dialogue. Anyway, this is just a point from what you said. Soli, your turn.
I find myself in. No, I find myself in the unusual position of sounding hawkish. I really think Turkey recognizing the Republic of Cyprus is a non-starter. We shouldn't even talk about it. On the other hand, I concur with Mustafa that we should have a much broader perspective and try to see if we can actually change it. And I also agree with Thomas Dokos's title, that we need to think of a new framework within which to actually push or bring Turkish-Greek relations forward. I think there are two problems, and we have to think about how to overcome them. One, as in other places, frozen conflicts at one point become unfrozen and can become threatening, and that's what's happening around Cyprus. Secondly, I think part of the changing landscape in our bilateral relations is the fact that Turkey's other problematic relations in the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean have also inserted themselves in Turkish-Greek relations. And already our relations are pretty complicated. Bring in the Egyptians, the Israelis, and everybody else, plus pour the energy on it, then we have a mess. First of all, maybe it would be very helpful to all parties to be slightly realistic. The gas in Eastern Mediterranean, all of it, that is Egypt, Lebanon, Israel, Cyprus, is 3% of the world supply. Demand in Europe, where this gas is supposed to be destined for, is not going to be increasing in leaps and bounds. The pipeline, EastMed pipeline, I understand that other people call it pipe dream, is too expensive to bear the current energy circumstances, and it will take quite a while. There are, in my judgment, all the ingredients to actually come together and create a mutually beneficial plan through which this energy can actually be exported to whichever markets it's going to be targeted to. For that, the Cyprus issue will have to be resolved one way or another. It will not start by Turkey's recognition. A two-state solution probably is not an option either, reasonably. But I personally, I don't accept the fact that the Greek Cypriots who reneged on their promise on the Annan Plan in 2004 should have a right to constantly block everything. And my concern here is not Turkey's strategic interest. My concern is the Turkish Cypriots' interest. We'll have to find a way of bringing the island into the European Union with a formulation that we really haven't talked about. Once that is gone, and I really do think that Cyprus is the big poison well in Turkish-Greek relations, once we can solve this, if it can be solved, then we can move forward. I really don't see the Aegean problems to the extent that I've studied them. The Greek-Turkish Forum wrote a very early letter on that issue. They are not unresolvable problems the moment the Cyprus issue is taken out of the way and trust can be reestablished between our two countries. I find the Eastern Mediterranean potentially a new economic zone in which Turkey and Greece can actually do a lot, and the Israelis will also have an interest in being engaged in. But that really requires that we first of all stop getting too excited and start talking with one another, and that is what is missing. I understand the concerns, and they are reasonable concerns, they are legitimate concerns, that Turkey's bluster in the past few years scares everyone. It is pursuing a very aggressive foreign policy. But again, think of it from Turkey's perspective on two grounds: the coup and the failure of the European Union members in standing by Turkey during that coup, including the United States. And secondly, the attempt to use the Law of the Sea Convention to tell Turkey that it really does not have anything to say upon how much it can expand its interests in the Mediterranean. These are not really simply legal issues. Thirdly, maybe that may play a role, not with the Trump administration, but with another alternative administration, that the love affair between Turkey and Russia seems to be cooling. The love affair between Turkey and the United States seems to be warming. And to the extent that the Americans will care again about Europeans, the transatlantic alliance, and NATO as an institution, which is probably likely if a non-Trump becomes the president of the United States, maybe as if it were in Madrid, we can actually find an institution within which we can move forward. But let's try to dissociate first Turkey's problems with the Middle Eastern countries from the bilateral issues that have been with us for such a long time.
And mute. Okay. Well, thank you, Soli. I wish I could have a debate with. We need to move on to Kostas. Again, it's the same setting. How do we move forward? We've been having a very interesting debate, and let's hear your thoughts, Kostas. Very quickly, also, because we
very quickly. How do we move forwards? Forward from where we are currently now, okay? And now we have an agenda that is crowded with the ever divisive security wars in both sides of the Aegean. The positions are maximalist. The context is zero sum. We are in a situation of standing our ground again, or rather, we have never moved away from it. So I'm afraid, within this context, we have run out of ideas. To my mind, Europe as a framework that can satisfy Turkey's preferences, is bankrupt for the time being. So there is nothing, at least to my mind, we can expect from Europe. Europe as a facilitator ran out of steam a long time ago. At the same time, there is no effective constituency that can offer something that Turkey finds attractive. There is no one capable of altering, I think, right now, the strategic calculus in Ankara. And there is nothing that can, I cannot see anything that can change Greece's perception that Turkey is a revisionist and opportunistic player. So I'm afraid, unless something dramatically positive happens, that we are looking at a period of not protracted conflict, but certainly protracted high-level tension. But this time, I think there is, for reasons that I explained earlier, there is a higher risk of the whole situation degenerating dangerously close to a not a tug of war, but a tug of violence scenario, given the perception also in Turkey of a very favorable balance of hard power, at least in some circles in Turkey. So talking about security dilemma that we discussed with Mustafa 20 years ago, the danger of a spiral is ever present. What I would like to see, but this is more, and I admit that, I acknowledge that it is utopian, but I would like to see a bold move of, let's say, a commitment to resolve disputes by non-violent means. Remember, we have not done this. Okay, so a declaration of principles, even today that the fault lines are intact. And then maybe we should start, a serious brainstorming and find a process that will allow very bold and very daring ideas to be discussed. Okay, a sort of Oslo process. Okay, and I know that that the actual Oslo process collapsed or failed soon after the official signing. But let's prove that we can do better. Thank you, Dimitri.
Thank you. We're running out of time, but also looking as you guys were talking to some of the questions, which we're not going to answer them all, but I think it's very interesting. First of all, I'm more convinced now because Mustafa and I have been talking about writing something, maybe even a book, and I think I'm more convinced after this discussion of the need to do this. And we've exchanged messages recently about moving forward. Because there's a lot out here, and I think the value added of what we have done, maybe we do not get into details, but we've also maintained, which is a thing that's missing, our training as political scientists and IR scholars and trying to understand the real issues and dealing with the issues. Because a lot of time the debate, especially the one that I follow in Greece, it's reactionary as opposed to really understanding what motivates, what is it that each side is concerned with. Now, some of the things is, I especially like some of the things that Kostas talks about. Maybe it's true, a declaration of principle about the non-use of violence might be interesting. One of the comments that has come in from a retired Turkish ambassador is the need, who disagrees with the fact that Cyprus is more important. He suggests it's actually the bilateral issues that are more technical and more important, and maybe there's a need to stress the revitalization of the exploratory talks. But this brings in another issue because we did not talk about it, because it also has to do with the administrative changes in Turkey proper after the referendum, which has also created some issues, not only in terms of Greek-Turkish relations, but in terms of Turkey's relations with other partners as well. And so institutions like the foreign ministry might not be what they once were. And this also creates some sort of issue out there. Some of the comments have also come in regarding, from Turkish participants, observers, about reflecting some of the things that we heard, that the EU might not necessarily be, it's not objective enough. On the other hand, my point would be that I'm more convinced, if and after this discussion, that Greece has no choice but to use the EU lever under current situations, and use the EU lever because it's a fallback from the accession process with its norms and its values and the framework that was there. And if that accession process is not there, then maybe what Panayotis Tsakonas talked about is what we go towards. And it's a discussion that some have been talking about, a big deal, a big package, which includes many issues, but there's a framework there which allows us to operate within. And I think this is probably the only plausible, realistic thing that we could aim for right now. And I think both sides need this. But I think there's a lot of food for thought here. I wish we had more time to deal with issues in depth. I wanted to say that Mustafa and I have talked about this in the sense that we plan to, first of all, we're continuing this series. Next week, actually, it's going to be a discussion on Black Sea security. We will promote it starting tomorrow with experts from the Black Sea region. But we will come back to Greek-Turkish relations, maybe in a format like this, maybe in a format where some of our speakers are people in the media on both sides and other actors also, to hear their perspectives. But I think also, given the interest and how many people actually signed in and actually followed us, we need to continue this. I also have some of our Cypriot colleagues want to talk about Cyprus. So Cyprus is also something that will be part of our later discussions. I have promised our colleagues in Cyprus, especially colleagues in the Greek-Turkish Forum, that we will be having a debate about Cyprus and how it all fits in. So I'm coming back very quickly to the speakers. Do you have anything to add, comment on what your colleagues have said? otherwise we'll be taking this to a close. So Mustafa, Kostas, Panayotis, Soli. No, okay.
I do.
Well then, you do. Okay, sorry. Go ahead, Soli.
Again, it's against my nature to be optimistic in relative terms, but I cannot arrive to share Kostas's pessimism about a period of long, protracted. Where will it come from? Where will it erupt? Why would it erupt?
Costa, you want to say very quickly? Perimene. Go ahead.
Okay. I remember we had the same discussion in Oxford a few years ago when my dear Soli accused me of being, a degenerate realist. Anyway, yeah.
That was 10 years ago.
Was it? So, okay, what I said, protracted high-level tension. Okay, so I think we have all the ingredients of moving, unfortunately, towards this situation, unless something happens that turns the table. Europe is not there. United States is not there. Turkey is engaged in 2 military campaigns. Okay, in Syria and in Libya. In Greece, because of as I said, the legacy of what happens since I would say 2015 and a nationalist turn. As I said, I cannot see a majoritarian constituencies that can drive the process, a positive process between the two right now. So in terms of what divides the two countries, the gap is still there, and we started looking at it again. So the fault lines are intact. Issues that have been deemed strategic, okay, because either they are linked to critical national security or national interest, critical national interest, or they are linked to national prestige, okay, or they are perceived as sovereignty bound, okay, are once more at forefront. Okay? As I said, the agenda is crowded with a very malign. There's no good faith anymore, I'm afraid. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm wrong. As I tried to explain it in my opening remarks, why domestic and regional structural influences.
Dimitris, may I add something on that?
Sure.
Because I very much aligned to what Kostas said. And actually, I was thinking of things being developing the other way forward. Actually, asking an optimist, what are the good reasons for feeling optimist? There's an old phrase saying an optimist is a less informed pessimist.
Okay. Mustafa, you want to say something also?
Well, I mean, you gathered all the realists here, and you cannot get alternative view. I would say, in the longer run, the realist view is never failed. So let's add a little bit more realism in Greek-Turkish relations. Actually, Soli touched upon there briefly when he was talking about Cyprus and Eastern Mediterranean. We always come across both in Turkey and in Greece, and also in a much more abundant way in Cyprus of unrealistic expectations. And this is not something new. You know, the history of Greek-Turkish relations since 1950s is about unrealistic expectations of both sides. And on top of it, Cyprus came. So dealing with reality is something, if we can enforce this and if we can entice both populations in both countries, then this is a success. Then the success story or a new kind of a story can develop from that emergence of from that reality check. So let me stop here.
All right. Well, thank you all for a very, very interesting and rich discussion, and our audience for sticking with us. And I look forward to having more of these, and hopefully have these in person as well. We need also our physical contact, which we've missed all these months in isolation, quarantine, and whatever else. Thank you again. Thank you again for taking part in this. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Dimitri.
Bye.